Hello and welcome. Anton Treuer is my guest tonight, and if you haven't read about him or heard of him, he is an Ojibwe leader. He's a professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State. Drove down for the interview tonight in this cold, icy weather here in Minnesota. We're taping in January of 2022. He was on my show. We were just figuring it out 10 years ago. Feels like 5 years ago, but he's back now. He is a prolific writer. He's doing all kinds of racial equity work. He's working to help the Ojibwe people get their language more solidified in their culture. And he's a busy man, so I'm grateful he could be with me tonight. I should say he's also a father of 9 children, lives on the reservation or near Leech Lake Reservation.
The res line goes right through our property.
Does it?
Yep.
Okay. Well, you, as I said, have been busy. The newest book you've written, I believe it's the most recent, right? Mm-hmm. It's called The Cultural Toolbox. And then the subtitle is important. It's The Traditional Ojibwe Living in the Modern World. And I'd like to just start out and ask you why you felt it was important and a good time to write the book.
You know, it was really good for me personally to take this book on at this time. It's probably my most personal writing to date. So there are stories about my children. I kind of feel like I grew up while raising my children as well. And their lives and mine are kind of windows into various dimensions of Ojibwe culture. Mm-hmm. And we're at a time of unprecedented change in the world. I think most people are aware, for example, of the threats with regard to climate change. People may be a little bit less well aware that while there's a declension in, species on planet Earth, that we're also at a time where there's a real declension in human bodies of knowledge and ways of knowing.
Yes.
As they are embodied in the distinct languages and cultures all around the world. So with language, there are nearly 7,000 languages spoken on planet Earth, but only 100 actively and widely taught at colleges and universities.
Oh. Would Ojibwe be one of them?
Ojibwe is one of them.
One of the 100.
Yeah. But, the future vitality of the Ojibwe language and culture might not be certain, but it's certainly possible, depending on what we do to share it, to teach about it, to preserve and revitalize it now. So that's why I got into this one.
That's important thinking behind it, isn't it? Do you sort of feel personally, Anton, that if you were not doing this, your language would be much more likely to be lost in a sense, or less used? Do you personally feel?
Really, for a language to live, for a culture to live, it has to live in the hearts and minds of young people. Mm-hmm. And on scale. So, one person speaking some archaic language that's no longer in everyday usage, that's not a living language, that's an academic enterprise. Mm-hmm. Oh, so I don't feel like my presence or absence is going to, be the deciding factor in, our language and culture living. But I do feel that I'm in a position to push for, catalyze, and significantly contribute to the revitalization of our language and culture. And I feel that that's the case with my lived experience. I officiate at various ceremonies. I'm training other people now. I'm in my 50s, and so, I have other people that I'm training in so that I can be replaceable many times over, which is my goal. But at the same time, You know, I feel like that work would continue with or without me, even though I feel like I'm in a position to contribute to it.
Somewhere in the book, you stated, or I understood you to state, that language is such a central part of culture, which is kind of course it is, but that also resonates with me in terms of the importance of pushing to help keep the language alive. And
Sure.
yet young people, you mentioned young people, they're often wanting to let go, to blend in more with, their classmates. And do you find that with young people that you do workshops with, or are they more eager to learn?
Well, it's both.
Okay.
I think it's in human nature. All of us both want to fit in, to have connection, to have belonging, to be included. That's basic human need. Back, throughout human history, we've only survived when we've been communal and be able to rely on the people right next to us. At the same time, all human beings also want to stand out and distinguish themselves and be special and unique. And it's like left and right hand. It might be a paradox. It might seem contradictory, but we need both things. And I feel like with regard to our language and culture, first of all, I'm not a purist. Like,
Right.
I
realize that reading the
we
book.
are ancient, yes, and we are modern. The culture that Ojibwe people had, before Columbus arrived, was perfectly well suited for that point in history. If I tried to live my life exactly that way, well, for starters, I wouldn't have been able to drive down here and take this interview.
We wouldn't be doing this,
Right.
would we?
And so the culture that I live necessarily has to diverge from that of my ancestors. But there's a tension, like all cultures have to change over time. And by the way, whoever comes after me 7 generations from now, they will necessarily have to have a different culture. They will have to repudiate some of the things that I believe in right now, because they'll be in a different time. And then there's also this question: how much can a people change and still be the same people? What things are acceptable changes? What things do we want to change? Maybe innovations in healthcare, things that might improve our longevity. And then what kinds of things are unacceptable? Can we not afford to lose?
Losses are deal
Right.
breakers, so
Right.
to speak, right? That's an interesting way to think of it. Thinking of your comment about Columbus, I just have to tell you, the viewers, that one of the aha moments when I was reading the Cultural Toolbox was a statement you made that I had no idea about. And he wrote that back when Columbus arrived here, there were 100 million indigenous people in North America, perhaps about 88 million, you wrote, in Europe. I don't think we have that realization as people, that it was that settled here.
Yes, it's very American to have historical amnesia. And of course, it's important to feed the narrative of American exceptionalism.
Yes.
To say that a few scattered bands of roaming nomads in the wilderness meant that those people weren't really using the land, and there was room for everybody who came. But the reality is, there wasn't room. And everyone else who came necessarily displaced the people who were already here. There's no way to understand European settlement, the birth of the American nation, and all of these other nations in the Americas without understanding that what was this beautiful Genesis, land of the free, home of the brave, opportunity for so many poor, disenfranchised Europeans, from the first Puritans to, people fleeing the Irish potato famine or whatever, that all of that was at the same time necessarily a genocide, a land theft and a taking from Native people. They're two sides of the same coin, and America has always struggled to look at both sides.
You have written how many books now, Anton?
I'm up to 20.
Are you? I was thinking 14 or 15 that I could account for. Up to 20. Do any of them focus on this as a theme?
Oh yes, so everything you wanted to know about Indians but were afraid to ask.
Which is one of your most well-known books, right?
Right, it's probably the bestseller. That's been out for several years, and then just in 2021 we released a young reader edition of that book, which took right off. And so that wrestles with, a broad range of topics, including history, politics, sovereignty, religion, current events, social activism, and touches on topics like this. I think honestly, I understand no human being wants to be judged by their darkest day.
No,
I don't, and no nation does either. But when we can look at, as individuals, our darker days, own that, atone for that, ask what would it look like to make that right, we show up as the best versions of ourselves. And when nations do that, they do too.
And we also, knowing what happened before, we can also understand why there is so much trouble too in the world right now in terms of the Ojibwe people, the Sioux people, everyone who's been pushed aside. Your brother David is also a historian and a writer and a Ojibwe leader, and in his book that is out, that I've read about, the title helped me with
The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee?
The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. Apparently he writes that we don't want to just look at the hard parts of the Indian culture right now. We need to look at both sides, and you're saying that too right now. Do you think that resonates with the general population, or do people seem to want to, look at the downtrodden side of life?
I think America's at a time of great change and challenge, and there are people who want a deeper, more fully nuanced understanding of these tough topics. But I think a lot of us have been left ill-equipped to really wrestle with them. And they touch upon, very important pieces of national identity and individual identity. And some people really struggle to look at our ugly chapters and reconcile them with our good chapters. What is America? You could even look at our Constitution and say, land of the free, home of the brave. Look at this wonderful language that we have in here. Our foundational promise is so wonderful. And yes, we the people only meant white male property owners, but without changing the Constitution, we were able to change our definition of who is we the people to include you, who are not part of we the people in the beginning, and me, who was not part of we the people in the beginning. And that's the beauty of America. And we can also look at that same Constitution and say, it was an enabling mechanism for slavery. That states' rights was not about the best way to create a polity so much as to have people who wanted to own other humans in the same country with people who didn't as part of the same nation. That the Second Amendment wasn't about the right to bear arms so much as creating slave patrols to police black bodies. Which version's right? And if we're truly honest, they both are.
Yes, there's
and some
truth
people
on
are
both
wedded
sides.
to one or the other and can't listen to those competing versions. The truth is, like any human being, every nation is complex and has all of these good and bad and so forth. I think America struggles with judgment, being judged, and it makes it tough. I don't want to spend all my time on the previous chapter. But we have to read that previous chapter.
Right.
So we can write a new, better, healthier, happier chapter. That's what we're doing.
And what the Black community is going through is such a parallel, isn't it?
Oh, sure.
In terms of looking at the ugly things that have happened in our country. And that, I think, must say that there's some breathing room here for people to get deeper, to go deeper, because it is happening.
It is happening. I do think that conversation's broadening. I think some are resistant to it. You
Sure.
can see the pushback. And ultimately, if you are Black or brown in America, you don't get to live as long as white people.
Right.
And anyone who wants
COVID,
to...
right?
What?
Example, COVID.
COVID, getting pulled over by a police officer. I'm not as safe as you are in that circumstance. The data supports that, health disparities beyond COVID, all kinds of things. And so that should be intolerable
Right.
to everybody.
Right.
And anyone who wants to stifle a discussion about that or say, please don't cry out in pain when you're hurting, it's going to be pretty hard to heal a nation when we can't hold space for one another.
Denial. Denial really is enemy here.
I think it's not just denial. That is true, it does happen, but I think it's hard for us to see things from a totally different perspective. And we are so wedded to the lens that we have. No one sees the world the way that it is. We all see the world the way that we are, and we're all different.
Well, this wasn't at all where I was taking my notes, but it's
all right.
fascinating. Let's switch gears a little and talk about some of the philosophies and practices that are in your cultural toolbox, which I need to have you define real quickly, that are so life-giving.
I think every group of human beings on the planet has their own distinct way, or even ways, of looking at the world and seeking to understand that and deal with the problems and blessings that may come their way. And that's the case with the Ojibwe as well. And I believe that that collective array of perspectives and tools that are embedded in any culture, that's what I mean by our cultural toolbox. And frankly, all of us as human beings have been deeply touched by colonization, which is taking one language, culture, and way of looking at the world and imposing it on the others. It's about erasure, and often using violence to make that happen.
Well, you have a story in the book that was just really intriguing and touching for me about your son, Elias, who's one of the middle boys or one of the middle children. Give us that as an example of a toolbox use.
Sure. So I have 9 children, and Elias is right in the middle of the pack. And I have a big blended family. So, my relationship with his mother didn't work out. She struggled and eventually descended into darkness, substance abuse, and things like that. And I think Elias was kind of the recipient of the kind of blessings and curses that only a father can bestow. And I was worried about him. He was an infant in arms when his mother exited from his life and never returned. And I always worried that this would trip him up, that he would feel loss and longing, that he would either deny himself opportunity for the sake of comfort or fear, or that he would run away from problems and abandon his roots. And there were moments during his childhood when I saw him engage with our cultural toolbox. We did a house blessing when he was really little, and we blessed an eagle feather that we ended up putting on the outside corner of the house. It was kind of like a protection when it was storming, and sometimes he'd run around outside and he'd just look at that feather to make sure it was still there. It seemed to provide some reassurance.
Kind of a security
security
blanket
thing.
Huh?
We had another one where we did like what we call a bear smoke. We make a miniature wigwam and we place offerings in there for each member of the family to hold us together. And he would, same thing, be running around playing with his siblings, and sometimes he'd stop and he'd look at it. Then he'd smile and run off, and kind of the same experience. And so I was just kind of watching these things and many other kind of milestones throughout his childhood. And he was a very social kid. He was in show choir, kind of our equivalent of glee club, and a performer, very, outgoing and social kid. And when COVID hit, it just shut down his world, They canceled show choir, no prom, and so he was just stuck at home with Dad.
And he's a high school boy.
Yes,
right?
And it was right during his launch time. And I was watching, what's he gonna do? Pushed him for a plan, and he came up with one and applied to all these colleges. And I have to say, what he wrote for his college essays was just so beautiful and powerful to me. He spoke to his experience with his mother, talked about historical trauma, his own lived experience, but then he put it into a context, and he just said, all the trauma, it stops with me. And it was really a powerful piece of writing. And eventually I came home, his college letters were in, and he had applied to Dartmouth, was kind of his first choice school. And so when he opened it up and got in, of course I was a big blubbering wreck and hugging him, and it was kind of like triumph through adversity. But as I thought about this experience for myself as a father, a lot of times people had told me, you saved those kids, you pulled them out of the darkness and you kept them going, and look how well your son's doing. And I always felt that it was entirely the other way around. That every time he was, looking at that bear smoke wigwam or the feather on the house, every time that he was finding a way through, the darkness, he was saving me. He was reinvigorating my faith in our cultural toolbox. And I believe that those cultural, milestones and tools that he picked up along the way made all the difference for him, but they made all the difference for me too.
That's such a win-win story, isn't it? And it's like, in my words, it would be, he reinforced the purpose of your life in a sense.
Sure.
And really benefited from it himself. So Dartmouth, that's a big decision to go that far away. And you went to Princeton,
right?
So you know that experience.
Yeah.
But that's shooting high, and knowing that you had done it, I'm sure gave him kind of a, well, I can do it too then, right?
He's master of his own destiny. I really feel like, he deserves all the credit for his successes in life. But I also feel like it is really, really vital to embrace all the parts of us as a human being. And I feel like he does a pretty good job of that. It's something I try to navigate in my own life. I got one foot in an ivory tower. I work at a university. I travel the world. I write books. But I got one foot in a wigwam too. And I feel like those roots and wings marry well. And it's something that might be useful to know for your listeners too, is that the value, for example, of the Ojibwe Cultural Toolbox, well, it matters a lot for Ojibwe people, but I think it should matter a lot for everyone else too. Solving all of our problems with the colonial way of solving problems is employing violence. White folk were really mean to each other for a long time before they took colonization to the rest of the world. Why would we think all of the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems can be solved by the colonial way of solving problems? And they can't.
And there's a quote in the book that I wrote down. I want to just share it with the viewers as we're needing to close here. But you wrote, "We depend on the earth, not the other way around. we are part of the web of life, not its masters.
Right.
And I think if we could all understand that, and I wish we had more time, you could explain it more, but I think there's such a sense in our country that so many want to be in charge, master all the animals, everything.
Right. Yeah, it's like we're playing Jenga with Mother Earth. Every time we pull a species out for extinction, it just destabilizes everything. But if humans disappeared from the Earth, everything else would get by just fine, better than ever. But
so
if
ironic.
anything else disappears, we're in grave danger.
We need the whole system, don't
yes, and we should respect everything that's out there. We should be thoughtful about how we engage with and use resources. No one is neutral with how we tread upon the earth, but there are many ways to be, and we should really think about the ones that we want to center in our lives as individuals and a nation.
Well, thank you so much for coming down and sharing your wisdom, the wisdom of the Ojibwe. And if you are intrigued, and I bet a lot of you are, the book I want to push that we've mentioned tonight is the Cultural Toolbox, and we'll give you a close-up of that. But it's a wonderful read. It's something I think that junior high and high school kids too could read without a lot of trouble. Here we get a nice close-up. Well, thank you. Are you able to stay in the cities and not have to get back on the freeway tonight, or are you heading north?
I'm going to go until I get tired, and then I'll hotel it up
Assess
and
it,
do the rest of it tomorrow.
Well, thank you so much. It's
Thanks
been
for
great
having
to
me.
see you again.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you for being with us. I'll be back again next week. Until then, have a good week.